40 years of marriage ended in a courthouse parking lot, inside one small cardboard box, beside an old pickup truck, with only a loyal dog left to witness what heartbreak had done to a man. Before this story goes any further, if you have ever been saved by the quiet love of an animal, subscribe and write that animal's name in the comments. Because stories like Michael's remind us that loyalty can arrive when everything else walks away. By sunset that day, Michael Hayes had no house to return to, no familiar chair waiting near the window, no wife beside him after 4 decades of shared mornings, hard seasons, and promises that once felt unbreakable. But what he did not know, as he sat with his hands frozen on the steering wheel, was that the old German shepherd waiting beside his door was about to lead him toward a secret buried for generations, a truth hidden so deeply that an entire valley had learned to live without it, and a second chance powerful enough to turn a broken ending into the beginning of something no one saw coming. The courthouse parking lot sat almost empty beneath a pale autumn sky. Dry leaves skittered over the pavement, pushed by a cold wind that moved through the bare branches along the street. Michael sat behind the wheel of his aging pickup and stared through the windshield without really seeing anything. His hands rested on the steering wheel. The key was in the ignition, but he did not turn it. He did not move. At 67 years old, he felt as if the world had quietly closed a door in his face, then gone on without noticing he was still standing outside. A cardboard box sat on the passenger seat. It was not large, but somehow it seemed heavy enough to hold an entire life. Inside were old photographs, anniversary cards, a silver watch, a few letters, and the personal things a court order could not divide with clean lines and legal language. 40 years. The number would not leave him alone. 40 years of birthdays and holidays. 40 years of arguments followed by forgiveness. 40 years of repairs, bills, dinners, quiet evenings, and dreams they once discussed as if time itself had promised to protect them. Now the house belonged somewhere else in the settlement papers. The future felt as though it belonged to someone else too. Even the small routines that had once given shape to his days had vanished in a single afternoon. Michael lowered his eyes to the wedding photograph resting on top of the box. 2 young people stood beneath a summer sky, smiling as though nothing in the world could outlast them. They looked certain. They looked fearless. They looked like they still believed love always found its way back. He touched the edge of the photograph with one finger, then placed it gently inside and closed the lid. Beside the truck, Duke sat patiently on the cold pavement. The German shepherd had not moved for nearly 15 minutes. He watched Michael through the open window with calm amber eyes. No questions, no disappointment, no need for explanations. Just loyalty, steady and wordless, the kind that does not ask whether a man deserves comfort before offering it. Michael opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air struck his face and made his eyes sting, though he told himself it was only the wind. Duke stood at once and moved close to him. The dog was 9 years old now, slower than he used to be, a little gray around the muzzle, but still strong, still watchful, still dependable. Most important of all, he was still there. Michael scratched behind Duke's ears and forced a faint smile. Looks like it's just us now, partner. Duke's tail moved once. For Michael, that was enough. They spent the rest of the afternoon driving without a destination. Small towns passed by the windows. Gas stations, empty fields, lines of fence, mountains rising blue and distant beyond the road. Michael had enough money to survive for a while, but not enough to start over with confidence. The retirement savings had been divided. Legal fees had taken more than he wanted to admit. But the numbers were not the thing hurting him most. It was the silence. It was the absence of a life he had believed would continue until the very end. It was the strange, humiliating feeling of being alive after the life he knew had already died. Near evening, he pulled into a quiet rest area overlooking a wide valley. Surrounded by pine-covered hills, the setting sun painted the land in gold and orange. It should have been beautiful, yet Michael felt only a deep exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones. He climbed into the bed of the truck and sat facing the horizon while Duke settled beside him. For a long time, neither of them moved. Wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Somewhere below, a train whistle echoed across the valley, lonely and soft. The world kept going. People drove home, made dinner, laughed at television shows, called their children, walked their dogs, and closed their curtains against the night. Michael wondered if anyone noticed when a life quietly came apart. Probably not. The world did not pause for private grief. Heartbreak did not get a public announcement. It simply happened, and everything else continued. Then Duke lifted his head. The movement was small, but Michael noticed it immediately. The German shepherd stared toward a cluster of old buildings near the far edge of the valley. Michael followed his gaze. Most of the structures appeared abandoned, weathered by seasons and half swallowed by brush. One building stood apart from the others, a modest old house with faded paint and boarded windows. Nothing about it should have mattered. Yet Duke refused to look away. His ears stood high. His body tightened with attention. Michael narrowed his eyes. Something about the property stirred a strange feeling in him. Not recognition exactly. Something older than recognition. A memory of stories told by his grandfather, stories about a family home that had disappeared from records long before Michael was born, stories no one could prove and no one wanted to discuss for long. Duke rose slowly. Then he took one step toward the house. Another followed. Michael watched him for a moment, and for the first time that day, curiosity broke through the weight pressing on his chest. Somewhere past the fading light, past the loss and loneliness, something hidden was waiting. And somehow, Duke seemed to know. Duke was not a dog who insisted on much. Over the years, Michael had learned the difference between a dog noticing something and a dog refusing to let it go. This was the second kind. Duke stood at the edge of the rest area, staring across the valley as if an invisible thread ran from his chest to that abandoned property. The last sunlight spread over the hills in copper and gold. Long shadows stretched across the fields. A crow called from a fence post, then flew into the darkening trees. Michael followed Duke's gaze again. The house looked old, older than most structures in the valley. White paint peeled from its siding in curling strips. The roof sagged near one corner. Several windows had been boarded shut, but the building did not feel entirely dead. It felt as though it had been waiting so long that waiting had become part of its shape. Duke took another step. Michael laughed softly, though there was no real humor in it. All right, let's go see what you've found. The narrow road leading down toward the property had nearly disappeared beneath weeds and brush. Michael had to guide the truck slowly over uneven ground, tires bumping through ruts left by weather and years of neglect. As they drew closer, the house appeared larger than it had from the overlook. A small barn stood behind it. Several outbuildings leaned beneath the weight of time. Nature had reclaimed most of the land, but signs of former life remained beneath the decay. Fence posts, a stone walkway, an old windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. Michael parked near the front gate and climbed out. Duke began exploring at once. He moved with quiet purpose, sniffing along the porch steps, around the foundation, near the corners of the house. Michael walked more slowly. The place reminded him of old photographs he had once seen at his grandfather's farm. Simple, rural, built by people who valued work more than appearances and expected a house to stand because family needed it to stand. He climbed the porch steps. The boards groaned under his boots. Beside the front door hung a rusted mailbox. Its paint faded almost beyond recognition. Michael brushed away dirt and curled flakes with his thumb. One word remained visible beneath the years. Hayes. Michael froze. The world seemed to narrow around that single word. Hayes. His family name. The same name written on old military records, on farm receipts his grandfather kept in a tin box, on the wooden toy chest that had somehow survived 3 generations. Michael stared at the mailbox, then looked back toward the valley, then down at Duke. The German shepherd sat calmly near the porch, as though the discovery was exactly what he had expected all along. Michael reached into the mailbox. Most of what remained inside had disintegrated into dust and brittle fragments. Then his fingers touched something firmer. A photograph. He eased it free carefully. The image had faded, but he could still make out a family standing in front of the very same house. A young boy smiled beside an older man wearing suspenders. On the back, written in careful handwriting, was a date from nearly 50 years earlier. Beneath it were 3 words. Hayes Family Homestead. Michael stared at the writing. His grandfather had spoken of a family homestead only once or twice, always in a low voice, as if the subject still carried pain. According to the old story, the property had somehow been lost before Michael was born. Records vanished. Ownership changed hands. Nobody seemed to know exactly what happened. Eventually, people stopped asking. Yet here it stood. Not vanished. Not imagined. Waiting. Duke barked once, sharp enough to pull Michael from the photograph. The German shepherd stood near the side of the house, ears raised, posture alert. Michael went to him immediately. Duke focused on a section of exterior wall near the rear corner and scratched lightly at the weathered wood. At first, Michael saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a narrow seam running vertically between the boards. It was too straight, too deliberate, as if one section had been replaced long after the rest of the wall had been built. The evening wind moved through the trees. Shadows deepened across the property. Michael placed his palm against the wood and felt a strange certainty move through him, the same kind he had felt walking out of the courthouse for the last time. Life was about to change direction. And Duke, faithful Duke, had known it before he did. Michael barely slept that night. The old house remained silent around him, while moonlight slipped through dusty windows and stretched pale lines across the wooden floor. He had chosen to stay there after finding the Hayes name on the mailbox, not because the house was comfortable. It was not. Broken furniture stood in dark corners. The roof leaked in more than one place. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and years no one had bothered to remember. Still, something about the place felt important. Familiar in a way he could not explain without sounding foolish. Duke slept near the front door, though he never fully relaxed. Every so often he lifted his head and looked toward the rear wall where he had scratched earlier. Michael looked there too. The seam between the boards remained in his thoughts. It was too carefully hidden to be an accident. Someone had built that wall to conceal something. Morning arrived under low gray clouds. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Michael made coffee on a small camping stove and stood in the kitchen with the mug warming his hands. Duke was already at the wall, sitting quietly before the same section of wood, watching and waiting. Michael smiled. You're not giving up, are you? Duke's tail moved once. That settled it. After coffee, Michael searched the barn and found an old pry bar hanging near a collapsed workbench. He returned to the wall and began working carefully. Years of paint and repairs had disguised the seam, but once he knew where to look, it became impossible to miss. A strip of trim came loose first. Then another. Dust lifted into the air. Duke stepped back, but never took his eyes off the opening. Finally, one of the boards shifted outward with a low creak. Michael froze. Behind it was empty space. Not a room, not even a closet. A narrow cavity, maybe 2 feet deep, built directly between the support beams. It should not have been there. He widened the opening and shined his flashlight inside. The beam landed on a small wooden box wrapped in faded cloth. Nothing else. No trash. No debris. Just the box. Waiting. Michael reached inside and lifted it free with both hands. The wood felt dry and surprisingly well preserved. Whoever had hidden it wanted it protected. Duke moved close at once. He sniffed the box, then sat beside Michael as though he understood the weight of the moment. Michael placed the box on an old table near the window. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. He opened the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, a bundle of letters tied with string, a photograph, and a brass key attached to a faded ribbon. The photograph drew his attention first. It showed a woman standing on the front porch of the same house decades earlier, smiling while holding a small child in her arms. On the back, in blue ink, was a name. Grace Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him yet, but he felt certain it would. He opened the journal next. The first page held neat, deliberate handwriting. This house remembers everything. If you found this, then someone finally came back. A chill passed through Michael despite the warmth of the coffee still in his body. He turned the page. The journal belonged to Grace Whitmore. Early entries described ordinary family life, the house, the surrounding land, the rhythm of seasons moving through the valley. Then the tone changed. Grace wrote of meetings, surveys, property records, documents that disappeared from offices where they should have remained. She mentioned fears she could not say aloud and questions no one seemed willing to answer. One sentence stood out from all the rest. They hid the truth inside this house because they believed nobody would ever return for it. Rain continued to fall outside. The floorboards creaked beneath Duke as he moved closer. Michael looked around the room, and the abandoned house no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a message that had survived across time. Somewhere inside Grace Whitmore's journal, The first true clue had begun to speak. The rain lasted through most of the afternoon. Water tapped against the windows while low clouds settled across the valley. Michael stayed at the old kitchen table and read Grace Whitmore's journal page by page. Duke lay near the wood stove, but every few minutes he lifted his head and looked at Michael, as if making sure he understood the importance of what he was holding. The deeper Michael read, the more the journal revealed. Grace described a time when strangers began appearing in the valley, asking questions about boundaries and ownership. At first, she thought little of it. Land surveys were not unusual in farming communities. Then old neighbors began losing pieces of property their families had held for decades. Survey markers disappeared. New maps replaced old ones. Records that should have been simple to find became strangely unavailable. Certain names appeared again and again in her writing: attorneys, developers, investors, county officials. But one name appeared more than all the others: Thomas Reed. Michael leaned back slowly. The name meant nothing to him, but it clearly meant something to Grace. She described meetings Thomas attended, land purchases he benefited from, conversations that left her uneasy. Then Michael reached a passage written nearly 30 years earlier. I overheard them inside the barn. They believe the original papers are gone. They do not know what Henry hid. Michael frowned. Henry. Another name. Another door. He kept reading. Henry Whitmore had been Grace's brother, a surveyor who spent years documenting property lines throughout the valley. Shortly before his death, he became convinced that official records no longer matched reality. Grace wrote that Henry feared certain documents would vanish forever if left in public offices. So he hid them. But where? She did not say directly. The entries became more careful after that. Grace stopped naming places. She wrote in clues, symbols, and fragments, as though she expected someone else might someday read the journal and need to follow the trail without being too obvious. Outside, the rain finally eased. A narrow shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the field behind the house. Duke stood immediately and walked toward the back door. Michael looked up. Again. The dog glanced back once, then moved on. Michael followed him across the yard toward the old barn several hundred feet behind the house. Its roof sagged slightly. Moss covered the boards. One door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Duke reached the entrance, paused, and stepped inside. Dust floated through beams of late afternoon light slipping through cracks in the walls. Old farming equipment filled the space. Rusted tools, broken crates, a wagon while leaning in shadow. The air smelled of hay, cedar, and age. Duke moved deeper into the barn with purpose. Michael followed carefully, feeling the boards flex under his boots. The dog stopped beside a workbench covered in debris. He lowered his nose and nudged something hidden beneath a pile of old cloth. Michael pulled the cloth away. Beneath it was a wooden plaque, weathered but intact. He wiped away years of dust, and a carved compass appeared at the center. The exact same symbol Grace had drawn again and again in the margins of her journal. Michael's pulse quickened. He examined the workbench more closely. At first it looked ordinary, but then he noticed shallow carvings cut into the wood. Numbers, directions, measurements, survey notes. Someone had not merely worked here. Someone had recorded information here. One carving stood apart from the rest. North wall, third beam. Michael stared at the words. Then he looked toward the rear wall of the barn. The light was fading. Shadows stretched across the floor. Somewhere inside this forgotten building, Henry Whitmore had left another clue. And judging by the way Duke fixed his eyes on the back corner, the next secret was closer than Michael wanted to believe. The words carved into the workbench stayed in Michael's mind long after the barn fell silent. North wall, third beam. It was such a simple instruction, yet everything they had found so far had mattered. Grace's journal, the hidden box, Henry's symbol. None of it felt accidental. Duke certainly did not believe it was. The German shepherd stood near the rear wall as evening shadows lengthened across the barn floor. Dust drifted through the last rays of sunlight entering through the boards. Michael grabbed a flashlight from the truck and returned to the north wall. The structure was rough and old. Thick timber beams supported the roof, darkened by decades of weather. At first, every beam looked the same. Then he began counting. 1, 2, 3. The third support beam was slightly wider than the others. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to matter once a person knew where to look. Duke walked directly to it and sat down. Michael smiled. You're not even trying to be subtle anymore. Duke looked up calmly. Michael ran his hand along the beam. The wood felt rough beneath his fingers. Then he brushed something smoother hidden under dirt and dust. A small brass plate, nearly invisible. He cleaned it with his sleeve. The compass symbol appeared again, engraved into the metal. His pulse quickened. Near the base of the beam, behind a stack of old lumber, a narrow wooden panel blended almost perfectly into the surrounding structure. Michael pulled gently. Nothing happened. He tried again, harder. The panel shifted. Dust spilled into the air. Behind it was a shallow compartment built into the beam itself. Hidden. Protected. Forgotten. Michael reached inside. A leather portfolio rested at the back. Beneath it lay a rolled survey map and several sealed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. Duke moved closer while Michael carried everything to the workbench. The portfolio looked older than the journal, older than the box in the house. The initials HW were stamped into the cover. Henry Whitmore. Michael opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes, survey calculations, property diagrams, boundary references. The more he read, the clearer the pattern became. Henry had spent years documenting discrepancies between official records and actual property lines throughout the valley. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion. Entire sections of land had changed ownership based on surveys that did not match reality. Then Michael unfolded the map. His breath caught. It showed the valley as it had existed before the ownership disputes began. Family names covered the land. Farms, ranches, homesteads, pastures, roads. Near the center of the map, one name stood out. Hayes. Michael stared at it. According to the map, the abandoned house and the land around it had belonged to his family generations earlier, not briefly, not partially, but entirely. All those years of hearing fragments of a lost family home. All those years assuming it had slipped forever into rumor. Yet here it was, preserved in ink, waiting in the wall of a barn for someone to care enough to find it. He opened the first envelope. Inside was a letter from Henry to Grace, written in steady, precise handwriting. Henry explained that he had copied every original survey before altered versions began appearing in public records. He feared the truth would disappear if no one protected it. The second envelope held correspondence with local landowners. The third contained something different, a notarized statement. Michael read it once. Then again. The statement named Thomas Reed directly. According to Henry, Reed had acquired large portions of valley property after disputed boundaries were approved. More importantly, Henry believed Reed knew the original surveys existed. The barn seemed to grow smaller around Michael. The air felt heavier. Outside, darkness settled over the valley. Michael lowered the statement slowly. Duke rested beside him, calm and alert, as though another piece of the truth had finally returned to its proper place. Somewhere beyond the old house and the forgotten barn, Michael understood something else. If these documents mattered this much, someone might still want them to stay hidden. That thought stayed with him through the night. Long after darkness filled the valley and wind moved through the grass beyond the house, Michael remained awake at the kitchen table, studying Henry Whitmore's documents beneath the yellow glow of an old lamp. Shadows crowded the corners of the room. Duke stretched across the floorboards nearby, but his ears lifted whenever the house creaked or the wind pressed against the windows. The house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as if it had spent decades waiting for someone willing to listen. Michael read every page Henry had left behind. Survey notes, property descriptions, letters from neighboring landowners. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. The disputed boundaries had not affected only one family. Entire sections of the valley had changed ownership through records Henry believed were inaccurate. The Hayes property was only one piece of a much larger story. Yet the more Michael discovered, the less he cared about acreage. The documents revealed something more important than land. People had known. Not everyone, but enough. Several families had challenged the changes. Their objections appeared in letters, meeting notes, and handwritten statements. Then, one by one, the protests stopped. Files vanished. People gave up. The valley learned to be quiet. Near midnight, Michael found a final note tucked inside Henry's portfolio. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if written in fear or pain. If Grace still lives, she knows where the last record remains. Michael read the line twice. Then again. Grace Whitmore. The woman from the journal. The woman in the photograph. If she was alive, She would be very old. But Henry had trusted her with the final piece. Morning arrived beneath clear skies. Sunlight spread across the valley, and frost covered the grass like scattered silver. Michael packed copies of the documents into a folder and drove toward town with Duke sitting beside him in the truck. According to local records, Grace Whitmore still lived in a small community nearly 30 miles away. The drive took less than an hour. Her house stood at the edge of town beneath several enormous oak trees. White paint covered the exterior. Flower beds bordered the porch despite the season. It looked cared for, loved. Michael parked near the gate. Before he reached the steps, the front door opened. An elderly woman appeared. Her silver hair was tied neatly back. Age had slowed her movements, but her eyes were bright and sharp. She looked directly at Michael, then at Duke. A faint smile touched her face. "You found the house," she said softly. Michael stopped. "You know who I am?" Grace laughed gently. "No." Her eyes moved to Duke. "But I know why you came." Duke walked calmly to the porch and sat. Grace watched him for a long moment, then nodded. Henry always said a good dog notices what people miss. She invited them inside. The house smelled of cedar and fresh bread. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains. Family photographs lined the walls. Grace led Michael into a sitting room where an old wooden chest rested beneath the window. She stood before it for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside were journals, letters, and carefully preserved documents. More history, more truth, more evidence. Grace removed a small envelope from the very bottom and handed it to him. Her expression turned serious. "This is what they never found." Michael opened the envelope carefully. Inside lay a single document bearing official county seals and multiple signatures. The original ownership certification for the Hayes property. Complete, unaltered, undisputed. The very record everyone believed had been lost forever. Michael stared at the paper in silence. Outside, sunlight touched the town. Inside, decades of unanswered questions suddenly moved closer to resolution. Beside his chair, Duke rested quietly, as if he understood that they had crossed another invisible threshold on the road toward the truth. Michael carried the document back to the old house as carefully as if it might shatter in his hands. The original ownership certification rested inside a weatherproof folder on the passenger seat, while Duke watched the countryside pass through the window. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the valley in long golden bands. Fields glowed beneath the autumn sky. For the first time since discovering the hidden compartment inside the wall, Michael felt the mystery forming a shape he could understand. Grace Whitmore's journals. Henry's survey notes. The original certification. Every piece pointed toward the same truth. But one question remained. If the document had survived all these years, why had no one used it? Grace had answered part of that before he left. Standing on her porch beneath the oak trees, she had looked at Michael and said, "Because the people who knew the truth were afraid nobody would believe them." Those words followed him home. The old house seemed different when he returned. Less abandoned, less lonely. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated floating dust above the floorboards. Duke walked straight to the kitchen table, where Michael spread the documents across the surface. The German shepherd sat beside him, watching. Michael examined the certification again. Every seal appeared authentic. Every signature matched records Henry had preserved. According to the document, ownership of the Hayes property remained legally recognized long after official maps suggested otherwise. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. Then Michael noticed a handwritten note in the lower margin, small enough to miss. Property review deferred pending county archive confirmation. His pulse quickened. County archive confirmation. Another trail. Another missing piece. The certification itself was strong, but the note suggested additional records existed somewhere else. Records that might explain why everything had gone wrong. Michael spent the evening comparing dates between Henry's surveys and Grace's journals. Around sunset, a pattern emerged. Several references pointed toward a county archive facility in a neighboring town. The building no longer existed in its original form. It had been converted into municipal offices years ago, but archives often survived long after buildings changed their purpose. Duke stayed near the table. Every so often he lifted his head toward the front window, watching, listening. Shortly after dark, he stood abruptly. Michael followed his gaze. Headlights appeared near the road leading to the property. A vehicle sat there, not moving, only watching the house from a distance. Michael remained still. After nearly a minute, the vehicle slowly turned around and disappeared into the darkness. Duke continued staring long after it was gone. The message felt clear. Someone knew questions were being asked. The next morning, Michael drove to the county records office. The building occupied part of an old courthouse built nearly a century earlier, with brick walls, tall windows, and narrow hallways that smelled of paper and history. After several conversations and a great deal of persistence, a records clerk named Sarah Whitaker agreed to help search archived property files. Hours passed. Box after box came out of storage. Most contained ordinary paperwork, tax records, permit applications, survey revisions, routine county forms. Then Sarah found something unusual, a reference file connected to the Hayes property. The folder was thin, almost empty, but one document inside changed everything. It was a transfer summary prepared years after the original certification. The summary referenced supporting evidence that no longer appeared in the archive. Missing records, missing surveys, missing approvals. Michael frowned. Where did they go? Sarah studied the page carefully, then pointed to a notation near the bottom. According to this, they were requested by a private representative. Michael felt his chest tighten. Who? Sarah turned the page. The answer sat there in black ink. Thomas Reed. Silence filled the archive room. Outside, traffic moved through town. Inside, decades of mystery narrowed around one name. The same name Grace had feared. The same name Henry had documented. The same name that appeared wherever truth seemed to disappear. Duke sat quietly beside Michael's chair, calm and steady, as if he already understood what the discovery meant. The mystery was no longer only about what had been hidden. It was about who had worked so hard to keep it that way. The name changed everything. Thomas Reed. Until that moment, the mystery had felt distant, buried beneath fading memories and forgotten paperwork. Now it had a face. A person. Someone whose name appeared whenever records vanished, surveys changed, or questions stopped being asked. Michael left the county records office with copies of the newly discovered documents while Duke walked beside him through the courthouse parking lot. The autumn air felt colder than before. The mountains stood beneath a gray sky heavy with approaching rain. Michael paused beside the truck and stared at the folder in his hands. Somewhere between the abandoned house, Grace Whitmore's journals, and Henry's hidden records, the story had become larger than family history. It was about choices, about people who guarded truth, and people who profited when truth disappeared. That afternoon, he drove back to Grace Whitmore's home. The elderly woman listened quietly as he explained what Sarah had found in the archives. Thomas Reed's name did not surprise her. If anything, she looked relieved. Then you are finally looking in the right direction, she said. Michael leaned forward. You knew about him? Grace nodded slowly. Her eyes drifted toward the window where afternoon light moved through the trees. Everyone in the valley knew his family became wealthy very quickly. Most people never asked why. Silence settled over the room. Duke rested near the fireplace while Grace stood and walked to a bookshelf in the corner. From behind several old photo albums, she removed a small notebook. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed. Henry gave this to me shortly before he died, she said. Michael accepted it carefully. The notebook contained dates, observations, and references to meetings. Most entries were brief. Then one section stood out. Henry described visiting an old survey office outside town. He believed original records still existed there. More importantly, he believed Thomas Reed knew it. Michael turned another page. A map had been drawn by hand. Simple, rough, but detailed enough to identify a location, an abandoned survey station hidden in the hills north of the valley. Grace smiled sadly. Henry always believed that was where the last missing records ended up. The drive took less than 40 minutes. Rain began falling before Michael reached the site. The old survey station sat alone among rolling hills covered with tall grass and scattered pines. Time had been unkind to it. Windows were broken. The roof sagged. Still, the building stood. Michael parked nearby and stepped into the rain. Duke moved immediately toward the entrance. The front door opened with little resistance. Inside, dust coated every surface. Old filing cabinets lined the walls. Maps hung crooked from rusted hooks. Water stains spread across the ceiling. The place looked forgotten, but it did not feel forgotten. It felt hidden. Duke moved slowly through the main room. then stopped near a collapsed desk in the rear corner. His ears lifted. Michael recognized the look at once. Another clue. Beneath the desk sat a metal cabinet partly concealed by fallen boards. Most drawers were empty. One remained locked. The lock had rusted long ago, and within minutes it gave way. Inside were several folders protected in waterproof sleeves. The first contained original survey maps. The second held correspondence between county officials. The third stopped Michael cold. It was a ledger documenting requests for public records, names, dates, signatures, every file removed from the archives tracked in careful columns. And over again, one signature appeared. Thomas Reed. Michael stared at the pages while rain tapped against the roof. The evidence no longer suggested involvement. It documented it. Every missing survey, every disputed record, every transfer request. The pattern stretched across years. Duke sat beside him, calm now, certain, as if they had finally found what Henry spent his life searching for. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Inside the forgotten survey station, Michael realized the truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting to be proven. The rain followed them all the way back to the valley. Water streaked across the windshield as the truck moved along winding roads lined with dark pines. Michael drove in silence. Duke sat beside him, glancing now and then toward the folder resting between them. Inside were the ledgers from the survey station, the missing records, the signatures, the proof. For years, rumors had drifted through the valley like fog. Disputed land, missing documents, families who lost property they believed had always belonged to them. Now, for the first time, the whispers had something solid beneath them. By the time they reached the old house, night had fallen. The storm had not ended. Wind rattled the windows. Rain drummed on the roof. Yet inside, the house felt strangely warm, almost welcoming. Michael placed the newly discovered records on the kitchen table beside Grace's journal and Henry's survey maps. The collection had grown into something remarkable. Every clue, every document, every hidden piece of history now occupied the same room. Duke settled near the wood stove while Michael began arranging everything in chronological order. Hours passed. The deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. Then he noticed something unusual. One of the ledgers contained a reference number repeated several times. The same number appeared beside multiple document requests signed by Thomas Reed. Curious, Michael searched through the rest of the records. Eventually, he found it again. It was not a file number. It was a storage reference. The notation pointed to a specific archive shelf that should have existed in the county records facility decades earlier. According to the ledger, several original ownership documents had been removed but never officially returned. Michael checked the archive inventory Sarah had shown him earlier. The shelf still existed. The documents did not. Or at least everyone assumed they did not. A thought formed slowly. What if one of them had been left behind? The next morning, Michael returned to the county archive building before it opened. Sarah greeted him with visible curiosity, and together they searched the storage shelves deep in the basement archive. Dust covered everything. Forgotten records stretched from floor to ceiling. Most shelves held exactly what the inventory claimed. Then they reached the section matching the reference from Thomas Reed's ledger. Sarah checked the catalog. This shelf should be empty. Michael looked closer. Something sat against the back wall behind a row of unrelated files, a thin metal box. Small enough to escape attention, large enough to matter. Sarah removed it carefully. The lock had rusted away. Inside were documents protected by aging plastic sleeves. Original ownership filings, survey certifications, property transfer reviews, records everyone believed had disappeared decades earlier. Then Michael found the document. The one Henry had spent years trying to locate. The final county review report. Signed. Certified. Official. The report concluded that ownership transfers involving the Hayes property should have been suspended pending verification of conflicting surveys. That suspension had never happened. According to the report, unresolved discrepancies remained when the ownership changed hands. Michael stared at the page. Sarah read over his shoulder. Neither spoke for several seconds. The significance was obvious. This was not another clue. It was confirmation. Official confirmation. Every journal entry, every survey note, every hidden document pointed to the same conclusion. The original process had never been completed properly. The truth had been documented, then buried. Sarah looked up slowly. This is what everyone was searching for. Michael nodded. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Light spilled across the courthouse lawn. Inside the archive, history had finally surrendered its last secret. When Michael returned home that evening, Duke met him at the door with unusual excitement. The German shepherd circled once, then sat beside the kitchen table where all the evidence now rested together. Michael smiled and placed the final report beside Grace's journal. The collection looked complete. Yet as Michael stared at the documents, one thought remained. The truth had finally been found. Now someone had to make the world listen. The review hearing was scheduled for the following week, but the Valley seemed to sense that something had already changed. News travels fast in small towns. A clerk mentioned unusual archive discoveries to a friend. A historian asked questions about old property maps. Someone remembered Henry Whitmore. Someone else remembered Grace. Before long, conversations that had stayed buried for decades returned in diners, feed stores, church parking lots, and front porches. Michael noticed immediately. People looked at him differently. Not because he was important, but because he carried answers. The old house no longer felt like a forgotten shelter borrowed from the past. It had become the center of a story many believed had ended long ago. Duke sensed the change too. He spent more time near the front porch, watching vehicles pass along the distant road. He remained calm, but attentive. Always attentive. 3 days before the hearing, Michael received an unexpected visitor. A dark sedan rolled slowly up the gravel driveway shortly before sunset. Duke noticed it first. He stood and walked to the porch steps. Michael followed. An elderly man stepped from the vehicle carrying a weathered leather folder beneath one arm. His posture was careful but steady. His face looked familiar, though Michael could not place it. The man stopped several feet away and looked at the house, then at Duke, then at Michael. "You're the one who found Grace's records," he said. It was not a question. Michael nodded. The man gave a faint smile. "My name is Daniel Mercer. My father worked with Henry Whitmore." Michael invited him inside at once. They sat at the old kitchen table while evening light faded beyond the windows. Duke settled nearby. Daniel opened the leather folder carefully. Inside were letters tied with string, the paper yellowed by time. "My father kept these hidden for years," Daniel said. "He always believed someone would eventually need them." Michael unfolded the first letter. The handwriting belonged to Henry. The second was Grace's. The third carried a signature that made him freeze. Thomas Reed. Not the Thomas Reed known throughout the valley, but his father, the original Thomas Reed. As Michael read, the final pieces began to settle into place, but not in the way he expected. The letters revealed a more complicated history. The elder Thomas Reed had not been the mastermind Henry feared. Instead, after discovering problems in the surveys, he had tried to reverse several questionable transfers. He died before completing the effort. His son inherited both the land and the confusion around it. Suddenly the story shifted. Not completely, but enough. The truth was not as simple as blame. Some people had made mistakes. Others had ignored them. Some had tried to correct them. Over time, details blurred until nobody remembered who had done what. Daniel pointed to one letter. "Read the last page." Michael did. Henry had written the words nearly 30 years earlier. "If the records ever return, do not seek revenge. Seek correction, because the valley deserves truth more than blame." Silence filled the room. Outside, the last light disappeared behind the hills. Michael lowered the letter slowly. The words felt like something Grace would have believed, something Henry had lived by, something the house itself had been waiting to say. Duke rested his head against Michael's leg, a simple gesture that steadied him. The hearing was no longer only about reclaiming land. It was no longer about proving someone wrong. It was about restoring what had been forgotten and giving the truth room to breathe. After Daniel left, Michael spent the night organizing every document across the kitchen table: journals, surveys, certifications, letters, archive reports, hidden records recovered from walls, barns, offices, and forgotten shelves. The collection told a complete story now. For the first time, no piece seemed missing. Duke lay beside the table and watched quietly. Michael looked around the old house, the same house he had found on the day he believed his life was over. The same house that had hidden secrets inside its walls. In a few days, the valley would hear the truth. And for the first time in 40 years, the truth would have every chance to be believed. The hearing began on a cold morning beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain. Clouds drifted slowly above the valley while sunlight touched the courthouse windows with pale gold. People arrived early: farmers, retired surveyors, local historians, families whose names appeared throughout the records Michael had uncovered. Some came because they remembered pieces of the story. Others came because they wanted to know whether the rumors were finally true. Michael sat near the front of the room. Duke rested beside his chair with the same calm confidence that had carried him through every discovery. The German shepherd seemed unaffected by the attention, though more than one person smiled when they saw him. By then, many people in the valley knew how the search had begun: a hidden compartment, a curious dog, a forgotten house. Rebecca Lawson stood before the review board surrounded by carefully organized evidence. Journals, survey maps, original certifications, archive records, letters from Henry Whitmore, statements from Grace, property filings recovered from storage rooms and secret compartments. Years of missing history arranged into a single timeline. The room fell silent as Rebecca began speaking. There was no anger in her voice, no theatrical outrage, only facts. One document led to another. One date connected to the next. Piece by piece, the story unfolded. Grace's journal established the first concerns. Henry's surveys documented the discrepancies. County archive records revealed missing files. The original ownership certification confirmed unresolved questions. The final review report proved those questions had never been properly answered. Every path led to the same conclusion. The official history accepted for decades did not match the surviving evidence. Witnesses spoke throughout the morning. Sarah Whitaker explained how the records were discovered. Daniel Mercer submitted copies of the letters preserved by his father. Historians confirmed the authenticity of the surveys. Former county employees described procedures that should have been followed but were not. Michael listened quietly. The evidence did not need him to dress it up. It spoke for itself. Around noon, the board paused for a short recess. Michael stepped outside with Duke. Cool air filled his lungs. Leaves moved across the courthouse lawn. The mountains stood beyond town exactly as they had for generations. Duke sat beside him and watched people move in and out of the entrance. "You know," Michael said softly, "I thought losing everything was the end." The dog looked up. Michael smiled. "Turns out it was the beginning." Duke leaned lightly against his leg. Sometimes loyalty was more powerful than words. The hearing resumed shortly afterward. By late afternoon, the board had reviewed every major piece of evidence. The chairperson, an elderly woman who had served the county for many years, adjusted her glasses and looked across the room. Silence settled over everyone. Farmers stopped shifting in their seats. Reporters lowered their pens. Even the old heating system seemed quieter. Then she began reading the findings. The review board determined that significant discrepancies existed between accepted ownership records and original survey documentation. Historical files supported correction of archived property histories. The original Hayes ownership claims were validated by overwhelming evidence. Additional historical revisions would be recommended based on recovered records. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then people slowly exhaled. Some nodded. Others wiped away tears. A few simply stared at the documents spread across the tables. Because this was never only about land. It was about truth surviving long enough to be heard. Michael looked down at Duke. The German shepherd rested with one paw stretched forward, eyes half closed, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Rebecca sat beside Michael and smiled quietly. They listened. Michael nodded. That was all he had wanted. Not revenge. Not victory in the cruel sense. Not wealth. Just the truth. As the room emptied, he remained seated a moment longer. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows. Dust drifted through the beams of light. The long search that had begun with loss, loneliness, and an abandoned house had reached the place Grace and Henry had always hoped it would. The truth no longer belonged to hidden walls, secret journals, or forgotten compartments. It belonged to everyone. The valley felt different after the hearing. Not dramatically, and not all at once. The mountains remained where they had always been. The fields still rolled beneath the wind. Roads still curved between farms and forests. Yet something subtle had changed. People carried themselves differently. Conversations lasted longer. Old questions no longer ended in silence. The truth had not fixed every wound, but it had given people permission to stop pretending those wounds were not there. Michael noticed it everywhere. A week after the hearing, he stopped at a small diner on the edge of town. Several farmers waved when he entered. The waitress already knew what he wanted to drink. Someone asked how Duke was doing. Another person shared a story about Henry Whitmore that had never been written down. For years, Michael had felt invisible, a man watching life continue without him. Now he felt something he had not expected. Connected. The feeling surprised him. More than once, he found himself sitting quietly afterward, wondering when the loneliness had begun to fade. Duke enjoyed the attention less than everyone else. The German shepherd accepted scratches behind the ears with polite patience, then returned to Michael's side, as though reminding the world he had work to do. The old house grew busier too. Historians visited. Surveyors asked questions. Families arrived carrying photographs, letters, and records hidden away for generations. Every week, another small piece of the valley's history surfaced. Not because people were searching for money, but because they wanted the story remembered correctly. One afternoon, Grace Whitmore arrived with a cardboard box filled with photographs. She moved more slowly than before, but her eyes still held the same determination Michael remembered from their first meeting. Together, they sorted through the images on the kitchen table for hours. Some showed family gatherings. Others showed farms long gone. Then Grace handed him a photograph he had never seen. Michael froze. The image showed his grandfather standing beside Henry Whitmore and several other surveyors near the valley ridge. All of them were smiling. All of them looked hopeful. On the back, someone had written a single sentence. Truth takes time, but it always travels. Michael stared at the words for a long while. The house was quiet around him. Sunlight passed through the windows. Duke slept beneath the table. The sentence seemed to describe everything that had happened, not just the records, not just the property, but the entire journey. Grace saw his expression and smiled softly. Your grandfather believed that. Michael placed the photograph carefully beside the journal. Outside, spring slowly transformed the valley. Wildflowers appeared along fence lines. New leaves filled the trees. Birds nested beneath the eaves of the old barn. The abandoned house no longer looked abandoned. Repairs had begun. Broken boards were replaced. Windows were restored. The porch was strengthened. But Michael left one section untouched. The hidden compartment inside the wall remained exactly as Duke had found it. Not because he needed it anymore, but because it reminded him where the story began. One evening, months after the hearing, Michael sat on the porch watching the sunset. Duke rested beside him. The valley glowed beneath golden light. Fields stretched toward the horizon, the same landscape he had first seen on the day he believed his life was over. He thought about the courthouse parking lot, the cardboard box, the truck. 40 years, ending with a signature. At the time, it had felt like the final chapter. Looking back now, he understood something different. Loss had not ended his story. It had cleared a path for another one. Duke lifted his head and looked toward the distant hills. Michael smiled and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. Together they watched shadows move across the valley. For the first time in many years, Michael was not thinking about what had been taken. He was thinking about what remained. And somehow, what remained felt like the greater gift. Autumn returned to the valley 1 year later. The fields rolled beneath a sky painted in gold and amber. Oak leaves drifted across the porch in slow circles, while sunlight settled gently over the hills. The house no longer looked forgotten. Fresh paint covered the siding. The roof had been repaired. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows. Yet despite the changes, the place still felt honest. It still felt like itself. Michael Hayes sat in a wooden chair on the front porch and watched evening light move across the land. At 67, he carried more gray in his hair than before, but something else had changed too. The heaviness was gone. The loneliness that once followed him everywhere had faded, not all at once, not through a miracle, but day by day as purpose returned. Duke rested beside him. The German shepherd was older now. White hairs had spread across his muzzle. His movements were slower, more deliberate, but his eyes remained the same, steady, loyal, wise. Together they watched the valley settle into evening. The house behind them had become more than shelter. It was a gathering place. Historians visited. Families came searching for old stories. Children listened while Grace Whitmore shared memories from decades earlier. The journals were preserved in a glass display case near the living room window. Henry's survey maps hung framed on one wall. The hidden compartment remained untouched, a reminder that some truths spend years waiting for the right person to notice them. Grace had visited often during the summer. Age had slowed her steps, but she still smiled every time she saw Duke. She always brought homemade bread. Duke always received the first piece. Some traditions became too important to change. Earlier that afternoon, she had stopped by one last time before heading home. Before leaving, she handed Michael a small envelope. "I found this tucked inside one of Henry's old books," she said. "I think it belongs with the others." After she left, Michael opened it carefully. Inside was a faded photograph. It showed his grandfather standing beside Henry Whitmore near the Valley Ridge. Both men smiled at the camera. Both looked younger than Michael had ever imagined them. On the back, written in careful handwriting, was one sentence: "Some truths take generations to find their way home." Michael had read those words several times throughout the day. They stayed with him now as the sun drifted lower. He thought about the journey, the courthouse parking lot, the cardboard box, the empty feeling after 40 years of marriage ended, the abandoned house, the hidden compartment, Grace's journal, Henry's maps, the archive records, every discovery, every impossible turn. At the beginning, he believed he had lost everything. Looking back, he understood he had lost one chapter. Life simply had not finished writing the rest. Duke slowly stood and moved closer. The old German shepherd rested his head against Michael's knee. The familiar gesture brought a smile to Michael's face. He scratched gently behind Duke's ears and looked out over the valley one final time that evening. The setting sun painted the fields in gold. Wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. The world felt peaceful, complete. The truth had been restored. The history had been preserved. The wounds carried by families throughout the valley had finally begun to heal. Yet none of those things felt as important as the simple fact that Michael was no longer alone. He looked down at Duke. The old dog closed his eyes and leaned comfortably against him. Home. The word meant something different now. It was not the house he had lost in the divorce. It was not the property records recovered from hidden places. It was not even the valley itself. Home was the truth that survived. Home was the people who protected it. Home was the loyal companion who never walked away when everything else did. The sun slipped below the horizon. Evening settled softly over the fields. And as darkness arrived across the valley, Michael finally understood the gift hidden inside all those years of loss. They thought they had buried the truth, but the dog found it. And in finding it, Duke led Michael all the way home.